Hi, everyone. Welcome to our JC Economics webinar. My name is Terence. I'm the co-founder of Ace Clinic Education and also the head tutor for economics. I graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science a couple of years back. Graduated with first-class honors in economics and started this tuition center and was in charge of teaching economics ever since. So spent more than 10 years teaching students doing economics across A levels, which is our main focus, but also across the IB, advanced placement, and IGCSEs. And today I hope to share with you some of the key insights that we have gained from our A level students and what it takes to do well in the subject. So really, we want to talk about three very simple things today. The first is I want to share with you what JC Economics is about so that you can help your child better understand the requirements of the subject. I'm also going to talk about the distinction between H1 and H2 economics because we know that a lot of you are probably still struggling with whether to go for H1 or H2. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. And of course, we're going to talk about why so many students struggle with the subject, what are the key challenges, and finally, how to master the subject and what to do about these major issues that a lot of students face. So let's dive right in. What is JC Economics about? Now, in a nutshell, economics at junior college is probably the most applicational subject that your child would face in 2 years, because it requires you to translate a lot of economic theories that you learn, in the lectures, in your textbooks, and turn all of that into real life, right? So the exams that you get in economics tends to be very real life, very applicational. It requires you to not just understand what you've studied in theory, but also know how to translate that knowledge into very applicational, very realistic context that they're going to present to you. And there's a tremendous amount of time pressure as well. So if we break down what the subject is about, there are really 5 key features here that we want to pay attention to. The first is, like with any humanities subject, economics is very content heavy. If we're thinking about the number of pages of notes that you're going to get, that's going to run into like easily 400 to 500 pages, which is the typical length that you will find of a university level textbook. Because ultimately, JC Economics is like, the foundation to higher level economics if you actually get around to uni to do the subject. So first of all, very content heavy. Secondly, as we mentioned already, it's extremely applicational. So one of the key challenges is you're not going to see questions exactly in the way that you learn them in lectures or in your lecture notes, right? It requires a certain level of translation from theory to real life, right? For you to look at a question and go, oh, I know what concept they want me to use here. So it's very applicational. It's very unlike any other humanities that you probably have seen up to this juncture, meaning if you compare it with history, with geography, with social studies, it's a completely different animal entirely. The third feature is that it's very keyword centric. So this is something really, really interesting to think about, because in traditional humanities subject, we're talking about history, we're talking about literature, we're talking about social studies and geography. There is clearly a certain amount of subject specific keywords, but economics takes this to the whole other level. And the way we look at it, the way I like to convey to my students is that economics at junior college level is quite like a science. It's quite like a science because when you're doing a science paper, you cannot just explain the answer in a layman fashion. You cannot just recreate an answer based on your own rudimentary understanding. You actually have to answer it in what we call an economically rigorous fashion, right? So you actually need to have a lot of precision in your explanation. You have to have a lot of keywords, a lot of key phrases, and it's not something that you can just make up on the fly if you don't fully understand what you have studied. The fourth feature is the heavy usage of diagrams, and this is really what sets economics apart from any other humanities out there. There's a huge emphasis on diagrams, and when we say diagram, we mean graphs, right? So for those of you in the audience that have done economics before yourself, you will certainly recognize something like the demand and supply diagram, right? Where this downward sloping line is demand, that's supply, and then from there, you could derive a quantity and a price for the market for something like cars, for instance, right? So this shows you a demand and supply model for cars. Students are expected to use models and diagrams like these to answer questions, whether in the context of an essay or in the context of a case study. So this is something that's truly unusual. And what we find is that for a lot of students, when they first start junior college, doing economics for the first 3 to 6 months, they go to exams thinking that diagrams are optional, but actually diagrams are very central to the subject. And it's really, really important that you have them if you want to have a chance of scoring well. And finally, economics is probably the subject that is the most time scarce, right? Everyone understands eventually that walking into an econs exam means you start writing from the first minute to the absolute last, and there's no time for water break. There's no time to go to the toilet unless you really have to, because it's just there's just so much to write in so short a time, right? So time scarcity is also a huge challenge. So 5 key features for JC Economics, which really sets the stage for us to explain to you what makes the subject so difficult. Now, here are some snippets. Over these 2 slides, I want to share a little bit about what the subject is like, in a very, very visual form. So here we have a 10-mark essay question about why governments intervenes in the provision of healthcare, right? So I don't want to bore you the details, but what I do want you to get out of this slide is to realize as you look through it, because we will send you a copy of this slides for you to look at. What you will find when you look at an essay like this is the first instinct that you have about what the question is about might be very different from what you're actually seeing here in this model answer, right? So that inherently is the challenge of econs, right? That's the challenge that we were talking about earlier. That's why we say the paper is really applicational, because we are given a very real life scenario here, right? The question is about healthcare. And it feels like when you first see a question like this, it almost feels like it can go in 1,000 different ways. But the reality is that because you're an econ student, they expect you to answer it in an economically rigorous fashion. So you have to be able to look at this and go, oh, here are the related economic concepts that I need. So when you look at this model answer, the first thing you notice, of course, is this really complicated looking diagram, which is something that students are expected to have in their answers, right? Diagrams, as we said earlier, are very, very central to the subject. And if you read the details, you will find that a lot of the language is very alien. Alien in the sense that you need subject-specific knowledge in order to figure out what your answer is supposed to sound like. So it's not something that you can write as a lay person. It's not something that you can make up and use plain English to explain. And that's why we say this is a bit like a science, right? If you don't know chemistry, you might not be able to, convey chemical names. Similarly, in economics, if you don't understand the theory, you cannot convey the requisite theories that's needed, right, to articulate that concept. And that will weigh heavily on your marks. So this is an essay right here, an example of an essay. This is an example of a case study. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but essays and case studies represent the 2 main forms of assessment, right, that econ students are going to expect. So here we have a case study. It's a bit like comprehension, right? If you want to think about it that way, it's kind of like comprehension, but once you learn the subject, we always tell our students that it's not like comprehension, right? It looks like comprehension. You're given a passage, right? You're given information and you're asked a whole bunch of short questions, right? But the sense that it's not like comprehension, right? The reason why it's not like comprehension is because in comprehension is part of an English paper. And in that paper, we are testing you on language skills, right? If you're doing English, you're doing GP and JC, comprehension is about language skills, the ability to comprehend. Now, economics is not like that. In a case study in economics, it's a bit more like doing a science short answer paper, because you are armed with requisite knowledge about the subject and they expect you to read the cases and infer, what do you think we are testing you over here? So what you notice about this paper is that there's a whole bunch of small extracts, right? We have 4 extracts here in total. We have things like charts, and this is extremely common. You should expect to get tables, charts, graphs. You get multiple small extracts. Sometimes this case study is about 2.5 pages long in terms of case material. Sometimes you could get more. It could be 3 pages, 3.5, 4 pages long even sometimes. So this is a highly disconcerting paper for a lot of students, because there is a lack of predictability. Because yes, you learn your econs, but it feels like they can give you anything under the sun. They can give you different types of diagrams and charts. They can give you different snippets of articles, and your job is you have to comprehend them and figure out what economic theories to use to answer the question. So again, it's like comprehension at first glance, but it's not like comprehension because the answering techniques are very different. You're expected to look and figure out the economic concepts and bring in the economic concepts to analyze the case, right? And that brings us to the comparison between H1 and H2 economics. So in H2, you basically have two papers at A levels, right? You have the case study paper. So we just showed you, right? The case study paper. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes long. And then similarly, you have an essay paper, also 2 hours and 15 minutes long. So case studies in H2, two compulsory ones, right? 135 minutes, 60 marks in total. So 30 marks each. You have 2 hours and 15 minutes to do it. And then you have 3 essays out of a possible 6. So yes, in H2 economics, you can choose your essays. And this has a huge bearing later when we talk about whether to do H1 or H2. So you have an essay paper in H2. You have to write 3 essays, 75 marks in total. It's actually 25 marks per essay. So earlier on, when we showed you the 10-mark question, that is not even half of one essay. That's actually just one part. So 3 essays, 25 marks each, and you basically have 2 hours, 15 minutes to write, which works out to be about 45 minutes per essay. So if you're wondering, right, this essay that we looked at earlier, this 10-mark essay, will typically be about 2 pages long, the answer, and you only have about 15 to 18 minutes to write. So that's what we mean by time pressure, right? There's a lot of time pressure here. So H2, right, 2 compulsory case studies, 3 essays, 2 papers, typically on 2 separate days during the A levels. Now H1 is 1 paper only. It's a 1 3-hour paper. You do 2 compulsory case studies also, but it's 45 marks each. Okay, so in H2, it's 30 marks each. In H1, it's 45 marks each. Now, here lies the problem, right? In our view, in my view, why I say a lot to a lot of my parents and students is H1 econs is not a very worth it H1 to take because it doesn't make your life easy enough, right? So for those of you considering H1s, typically, you know, because you have 3 H2s and then you want to do 1 H1, right? And the whole point of doing a H1 is, you see, it's supposed to be worth less than the H2, right? In terms of a rank point system when you're applying to university. So the whole idea here is that if you want to be doing a H1, you want to do something that's truly manageable. You want to do something that's truly easy, right? But with H1 econs, the problem here is you might look at it and go, hey, there's no essay paper, but here's the catch. You notice that there are more marks in the H1 case study than in the H2 case study. And that's because you have this additional question that can be anything from 12 to 15 marks. So it's almost like a mini essay. And therein lies the problem. Because the 12 to 15 mark mini essay in a case study is harder than a normal essay question. And the reason why we say that is because in a case study, it is very context heavy. You have a whole bunch of articles, as we showed you earlier, right? They give you information and they expect you to utilize the information to answer the question. Whereas in an essay, you have more freedom, right, to decide what points you want to include, what you want to discuss. So that makes a pure essay relatively easier to do than a long mark question in H1. That's our opinion, right? Based on our feedback, you know, talking to students, we do believe that most students do agree with us that the H1 econs is not super worth it to take. So we do want to caution you, right? If you have an option of dropping something else to H1, we will recommend that. One of the key arguments that people make about doing H1 is that, oh, you have fewer chapters than H2. Now, this brings me back to my point about essays. You see, because you can choose essays, that actually gives you the opportunity to kind of spot questions, right? You can totally ignore certain questions or certain chapters. Now, because of that, very commonly, we see students skipping this and that. which you notice, right, is the 2 extra chapters that the H2 students have that the H1 students don't. So because of that, we also feel that, it's more worth it to do the H2 than the H1. Now, there is a caveat. The caveat is you can't completely ignore these chapters because they can appear in the case studies because they're compulsory, right? So you do have to study a little bit more than the H1 kids, but if you're concerned about the essays, you actually have a lot of power, right? So it's something for you to weigh, because the truth is the H1 case studies are really not that easy, right? There was a syllabus change 3 years ago where H1 used to have an essay paper, and then they decided to take it away and they merged it into the case study itself, which in our view made the paper more difficult, right? But that's something for you to think about. Okay, so that's the basics of the subject and H1 versus H2. So now let's talk about the thing that everyone's interested in, which is why do people struggle with econs, right? So here's a rather scary statistic, right? That really emphasizes the challenge that students face in economics in year 1. And that is, in some JCs, right, historically, from our own data and observation, the failure rate for economics at H2 level, because most students take H2, the failure rate for H2 econs can be as high as 50% in some schools at the end of J1. That means the J1 promo exam. Some schools have more than half the students failing economics. And by fail, we don't mean 50 out of 100, because in JC, the fail grade is a U, and U is less than 40%. It's not even 50%, it's less than 40%. So that's how badly students crash. It doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen uniformly across all the junior colleges, but it can get quite bad, right? And econs is the subject that a lot of students struggle with because it's so new, it's so different. So there are 3 fundamental reasons why they fail, right? The first is this. I like to make this analogy, which is when you go for econs lessons, it's a bit like the teacher's teaching you how to crack an egg. But when you go to exam, the exam question asks you how to bake a cake. So to bake a cake, you need to crack an egg, but that's only one step, right, of the entire process. So it might be a bit of an exaggeration, but the reality is there is a big chasm between what you learn in theory and what actually comes out in exams. So one of the most common reasons that students fail is that they don't understand what to do when they get a question, right? They just get lost. They see it and they freeze. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. So students start putting down whatever they can think of, and that is never a good strategy to passing. You wouldn't pass if you just put down whatever you can think of. It doesn't work like that. There are marking requirements. There is a certain basic structure that they need, right? And if you don't deliver on that, you will never get the marks. Number 2, the failure to understand the content. So econs can be quite abstract. And what we have found historically is that students that lack general knowledge, right? Students who are not that well read, are not so in the know of current affairs, tend to struggle more significantly with econs. Now, the truth is, econs can be easy for some students, and it is easy for those who are not necessarily super well read. It's not about how much books you read, but about the awareness of like news and current affairs, because econs touches on a lot of real life stuff. So if you intuitively and innately understand some of these real world topics like, property prices, how is the economy doing? What's the unemployment rate? What's the Federal Reserve doing? What's quantitative easing? If you understand some of these things casually, intuitively, it makes it easier. Conversely, for those that have no idea about anything out of academics, tend to struggle quite significantly with econs, because there are a lot of things that are supposed to be commonsensical, but doesn't seem very commonsensical to them. So they have to spend a lot of time and effort trying to understand these basic things that might come a bit more intuitively for their classmates. All right. And finally, the biggest challenge that a lot of people have after being able to understand and being able to do questions is they can't do it in time, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but there is a way around this, right? There's a way around this, and it's not so much to do with writing speed. But the reason why there's a lot of time pressure is because you really have to write a lot. Like the good quality essays, for example, you have to write like 5 to 6 pages in 45 minutes for an essay question. You have to write about 4 pages, including your reading time, right? When you're dealing with case studies. So look at this. You have 1 hour, 7.5 minutes to read and answer 30 marks worth of questions, right? So it's very challenging. So if you're not quick, then it could be a challenge, right? So most students fail for one of these three reasons or some combination of these three reasons. And very often, right, when we get phone calls from June to, June, July, August, leading to promos in J1, right? One of the very common complaints that we hear from parents and students is, oh, I kind of get the content, but I don't know how to answer questions. So that already tells us, it's very clear that this is the biggest problem that everyone has, which is the failure to translate questions into economic content. So what we find is for students that join us really, really early, right? Students that join us in December when we do our Headstart programs and all that, they tend to have a smoother journey because they understand the requirements from day one. They know what to look out for, and it doesn't get so demoralizing. They are generally able to keep pace, to stay on track, and that generally helps a lot, at the end, especially when they're pushing for A-levels. So learning the subject right, understanding that, hey, you got to go scrutinize the marking requirements is quite important. So for those of you that want to give your child a head start, one of the useful things you could do is go to Popular, pick up like a 10-year series, or wait for us to update you with ours, because we're publishing our own in January, and we'll probably give away a couple for free. So either wait for that in January, or go to Popular right now, pick out a couple of books and start reading, right? And start getting a sense of, oh, this is what you like to ask, and this is what the answer is supposed to look like, right? And that will help you, get in the right mode to answer these econs questions. So just a very quick, sample question again, just to talk about the whole abstractness of things, right? So you have a question like this. This is what we call a preamble. So in recent years, they'll always give you like some little snippet, and then they ask you an essay question about it, right? So this is the applicational aspect. You look at it at first glance, you're like, I don't know what this is about, right? What do I need for this essay, right? So as you go along, students will realize that, oh, a 15-mark question needs to be argumentative, and an argumentative answer means that it has to be a two-sided answer, and things like that are really, really, really important. These are what we mean by marking requirements. If you don't realize that, you're never going to do well, okay? So if we want to dive deeper and look at the underlying reasons, right? So why do students struggle, right? So the three reasons here are what we showed you 2 slides ago. And now we want to give you the reasons. The first about understanding marking requirements really comes down to this. One thing that students find very difficult to come around to psychologically is that they can't accept, I guess, for a very long time, that humanities, economics is something that you need to practice for. Because when you came from secondary school and you're doing like, history, literature, geography, social studies, we associate humanities with the need to memorize only, right? But we don't associate humanities with, oh, I need to practice writing essays. But for economics, every year without fail, the students that will get U from the first exam to the last exam are those that don't practice. Just relying on school to give you homework, tests, exams, to do your practices is not enough. You got to practice writing essays. You got to study the essays. You got to redo essays, redo case studies. You got to look at model answers to give yourself a sense of, oh, this is what they like to ask. This is what they need. Here's what my answer needs to look like. So without the practice, without forcing yourself to have to explain things in econs terms, you wouldn't realize what the gaps are in your knowledge. So this is the leading cause of failure, which is the failure to recognize that, yeah, I need to buy the 10-year series. I need to have practice questions. I need to know how to answer questions. The second reason for failure is not spending enough time to digest and understand content, right? So earlier we mentioned that a lot of students come to us and say, oh, I get the content. Here's the problem. Normally, if you're getting an S or U, which is you're under 50%, right? You probably don't understand the content, right? No matter what you might think. And the primary reason for that is because econs cannot be answered roughly. It needs to be precise. So you need to truly understand the diagrams you're drawing. You need to truly understand the concept you're explaining. Or at least you need to have a formula for explaining those things, even if you don't quite get it. So when students go to class and they listen to the lecture and they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah, this makes sense. That concept makes sense. It's never good enough because it might make sense to you, but it doesn't mean you can explain it. So spending time to analyze and digest content and practice explaining content becomes really, really important. And the last is this, which is the time pressure. The key here is you do want to build your writing speed. That is important, right? Practicing writing and realizing that I have a time constraint is obviously going to be quite important to helping me finish the paper. But that in itself is not enough. What you need is also question exposure, because question exposure increases the speed of analysis. You look at a question and can more quickly identify what it is, the faster you can start writing. And that saves you a tremendous amount of time and helps you to finish the paper faster. Okay, so those are the three underlying reasons why they struggle. Now, practice is the most important step to mastering econs. We don't have to write a tremendous amount of essays, right? It's very time consuming and it's very painful to write. But what we are saying here is that every time you have an exam or test come around, you need to be writing a bit at least. 1 essay, 2 essays, right? It's the bare minimum. So we would say over the course of a year, right? Especially, let's just say 2 years, right? Over your JC life, as far as practice essays go, we would say that you need to at least have written 30 to 40 out of school essay requirements, right? That is the benchmark that we see for our high performing students. If you don't at least do 30 to 40 full essays and you're not scoring well in school, then you're probably going to be in trouble. Right? And this doesn't even include practicing question analysis and outlines and all that. These are full practices. So for the H1s, right, that will mean you need to practice writing full case studies as well. So the full practice is super, super key. Just pretend like you're doing math, right? That's the amount of effort you need to put into practicing. Now, if we can go into more detail, right? So what exactly do we need beyond just, practice? 3 things, right? 3 things, 3 key things. The first, as we mentioned, is practicing. So TYS is good for that. That's a good starting point, right? So get the 10-year series, look at the 10-year series questions. So what we like to say is that the TYS is the bare minimum for you to get a B. You need to be able to look at the 10-year series questions and be proficient. And proficient means you must be able to recognize, hey, what does the questions want from you, right? What do the questions mean when they say this? What does the marking requirement mean? And you need to make sure that when you practice, you can deliver a textbook grade explanation of economic theories. Not necessarily identical to the lecture notes, but close enough. It needs to be very rigorous. Rigorous means details written in an economic fashion. And economic fashion means it's something, the paragraph that you write has to be something that a non-econ student cannot say. If what you write a non-econ student can say, then it's not economically rigorous. Okay? So practice with past papers, number 1. Number 2, spend time on memory work. A lot of students struggle with this. A lot of students, when they realize, when they start being able to recognize questions, they think that they can do them, and then they get tricked by this step. So you need to spend time on memory work. As with most content-heavy subjects, right, we recommend using things like mind maps, right? Come up with your own mind maps, make notes. This is also something that's common across all our top performing students. You need to take the knowledge and sit down and compress it. You need to recite stuff to yourself. Oh, what is the explanation for the price mechanism? Or what's the explanation when I talk about why healthcare needs to be provided for by the government? There are very fixed template explanations that you need to have in econs. And for you to do well, you need to spend time, sit down, and do memory work. You cannot rely on just flipping lecture notes. The surefire way to fail is you go to school, you listen to lecture, you do your minimum homework, you flip lecture notes when you're revising. That's a recipe for failure. That's not enough. You got to spend time to sit down and memorize, make notes, compress mind maps, practice. And finally, when it comes to speed, the biggest time saver is when you look at an essay question. Remember we said earlier that you have 45 minutes to write an essay. So if you can go in, right, and this includes thinking and planning time. They don't let you look at the paper first. So the 45 minutes includes planning. The faster you can plan, the faster you realize what the question needs, the more time you have to write. And the more time you have to write, the more you can put on the paper, the better you have a chance to score. So just think about it, just a simple minute difference, right? Someone who has 40 minutes to write versus someone who has 45 minutes to write. There is this person can write 10% more than you, more than 10% more than you, in fact. right? And it will be hard to make up for the deficit. So you want to maximize your writing time, write as much as possible. And that requires question exposure. So we said 10-year series is the baseline to get a B. What you need is you need to look at other school prelim questions as well. Right? So the formula is not too different from how we deal with PSLE, O-levels, which is we need to do past papers. We also need to do other school papers so that we got a good mix. We got a healthy enough mix of questions, right? To make sure that, oh, okay, we can recognize questions really quickly and we know what the questions want from us. So 3 steps, right? Practicing past papers, spend time on your memory work, gain exposure to train your speed, as well as your proficiency. So what do we do at ACE, right? So we coach our students, based on 3 really, really crucial things. The first, which we spend a lot of time building, is we have a huge, deep repository of materials. One of the key things that we have is we have an online content platform that all our students get access to. And in there, we compress the whole syllabus, the entire syllabus content into 200 short concept videos. So every video is like maximum 10 minutes, average 5 to 7 minutes. And what this does is that it becomes a very useful on-demand tool for our students to be like, I don't understand this concept. I'm going to go and watch this video. I don't understand the concept. I'm going to watch this video. So we even have students that use this like a podcast. They listen to it on the app on the way to school on exam days. So we make sure our students are really, really well resourced, right? We make sure that if you're with us, you don't really have to buy 10-year series because we're going to give it to you. You don't need to get prelim questions because we're going to give it to you. We're just going to give you every single thing that you need, right? Condensed notes, mind maps, cheat sheets, model answers. The whole focus on materials is so that you have everything you need and you know what to focus on so that you don't have to worry about anything else, right? You just come to us and everything's covered. We talk about economics being a very applicational paper, and that will mean that techniques are very important. It's not a subject that you can spot questions for. So what you need to be able to do is you have to make sure that you can handle anything that they throw at you, right? So we like to use a sports analogy here, right? Which is, when you train yourself in a sport, you train your technique, you train muscle memory, you train the stroke so that you're always going to be consistent in how you hit the ball, right? So it's the same thing over here, which is what we teach you at ACE is we give you the tools and the steps that you always need to use, no matter what question you get, right? So we make sure that we give you the exposure, we show you what they can test you, we show you how to dissect it, and we show you how to always relate the questions back to what you know and write good quality answers. And the last thing, of course, is we know that everyone needs a bit of individualized attention, right? Everyone needs their questions answered, even in a group class setting. So even for our group kids, we have this model where we have consultations, right? So this goes beyond just regular WhatsApp or email, right? Every time exams draw close, we talk to our students like, where are your gaps, where are your issues, and we try to give everyone a slightly customized study plan, right? We sit down with you and go, okay, this is what we think you should do over the next 8 to 10 weeks, as you build up to A's. Here's what you should do over the next 4 to 6 weeks as you build up in mid-year. So we try to plug the knowledge gaps, right, that students have, and try to give them a roadmap as to here's where you are, and here's what you need to, where you need to go, and here's what you need to do in the process. So we want to share with you, right, this Headstart program that we're running. So every year, around December, we run it once in December, twice in December actually, and we run it another time in January to catch the JAE kids, the O-level kids. And this Headstart program, it's a 2-day program. You can just come for the first day, which we call the Grand Tour, and there's a day 2, which is called the Engine Room. So fancy car names, but what they are essentially is this. So the Grand Tour is a very high level, macro view of the subject, right? Which is we introduce students to what economics is about using elements that they are expected to see when they accrete economics in JC. So there's a lot of discussion of real life newspaper articles. There's a lot of discussion of economic concepts in a very approachable and very real life fashion, right? So it's about, housing prices have risen a lot in Singapore over the last 2 years. Let us tell you why, right? Singapore's economy didn't do well last year because of COVID. Let us tell you why. So we try to draw all these real life stories, to something that they can relate to, and we inject economics in the process to let them get the sense of, hey, this is something that maybe I can understand and I find easy to comprehend. Now, the Engine Room, which is the second day, so it's kind of like you could come for Grand Tour only, but if you are if you want to cover engine room, the grand tour is an important prerequisite. Okay, so the engine room is a deep dive. So the engine room, we take the first term's work in JC and we compress it, and we give students a sense of, here's what you're going to learn. These are the essay styles you have to do. Here's what a model essay looks like. Here's what a case study is. And we're going to give them a taster, right, of the skills that you need and the kind of exams they're expected to face when you actually do economics. So for those of you that are still undecided, right, or for those of you that are worried that don't know whether your child can handle the subject, given how much, I say that it's difficult, this is a great chance, right? This is a great way, 2 days, get a sense, right? And then you can make a better decision about how well you can handle the subject, right? Is it intuitive for you? Do you need to get extra help from day one? Or, is your child going to be able to manage it themselves on their own quite easily? So this is a good program to come for, especially if you're still a bit undecided. Then we strongly, would love for you to join us for 2 days just to get a sense of, what economics is about and whether your child will enjoy the subject. Okay, and that's it. That's all there is for today. Thank you so much for your time and for joining me today. That's my contact details. If you have any questions at all, you want to arrange the free consult with me to talk more about economic choices and what should be done and how to prepare your child, please feel free to reach out either by WhatsApp or email, and I will get back to you. So that's the end of my presentation. Have a very, very great day, and I look forward to seeing all of you really, really soon. Thank you.